Welcome to the Responsible Bytes podcast, everyone, the podcast where we talk about all things safe and responsible technology. I'm your host, Dr. Zena Assaad, and today I am joined by Dr. Lorenn Ruster, who is a researcher at the Australian National University and an independent advisor on responsible AI practices. Welcome back to the podcast, Lorenn.
Thanks so much for having me, Zena.
It's great to have you back on the podcast. The last time you were here, we were talking about human dignity and AI, and this time you're here to talk about human dignity and AI.
A big thing. Yeah.
It is a big thing. Just for some context for our listeners, the reason it's a big thing is because this has been quite a big week for AI because the Pope has now weighed in. The Pope has entered the chat. So this week, the Pope released an encyclical called Magnifica Humanitis on safeguarding the human person in the time of AI. And this encyclical makes a lot of mentions of human dignity. So I actually did a search and there are over 100 mentions of human dignity in the encyclical. So as somebody whose core research is on human dignity and AI, can you give me a little bit of an idea of what your first thoughts are on the encyclical and how human dignity is represented in that text in the context of AI?
Great, thank you. I mean, I think that it is a really important moment for how we think about dignity in the context of AI. Obviously, having an encyclical, these documents take quite a bit of time for popes to create. They're also often generally quite long-lasting documents. I mean, in this particular encyclical, you can see references to encyclicals from, tens, the last century that are in this document as well. And they really can be long-standing documents that guide how we do practices and how communities, not just the Christian or Catholic community, thinks about this broader topic of who are we as humans in this age of AI. And so for me, it's really interesting and exciting because I've been thinking about the context of dignity and AI and that intersection for some time now. And that's been the focus of my PhD I've recently finished. And what's really striking for me about the encyclical is that dignity is really the cornerstone piece of the encyclical. The importance of and the centrality of dignity when thinking about AI is really covered in this document. And it's interesting when you say you found over 100 references. Often I do that control find in other examples of documents that I find. And, you find one or two instances where they talk about dignity, but often it's not really dealt with in a specific way or in a sort of a deep way. And this document is sort of the other end of that spectrum. So not only is there lots of reference to dignity,
yeah, it really is
brought up lots of times, but there's also lots of ways in which it is talked about. So for example, and if people are sort of looking at the document, it's obviously quite a long document. So I'll just make a few different references if people want to go look at it in more detail. But in paragraph 52, it talks about the different types of dignity. So moral dignity, social dignity, existential dignity, but their focus here being on ontological dignity, which is really about at the essence of who we are as humans and this inviolability that all humans have dignity, and that being at the heart of who we are as humans. And I think the other thing that's really interesting about this encyclical is that it positions dignity as one of the social doctrines of principles of the social doctrines of the church. So there's other principles that are also discussed around the common good and dignity and the common good sort of co-appearing a lot of the time. Dignity and social justice, dignity and responsibility, dignity and other ideas of subsidiarity or solidarity or universal destination of goods. But there's also some practicality in this document, which I think sometimes is not necessarily what you expect from a document like this. So in paragraph 164, it talks about what favoring human dignity means in more practical terms, and some specific things about it needing transparency and accountability, which we hear about a lot in the general discourse, inclusion and access being really important, and ensuring equity through, I suppose, structural reforms. And so these elements being a really big part of enacting dignity. So I think that it's a really interesting document to understand different ways in of thinking about dignity from this Catholic perspective. And I think at the heart of it is a call to action around that the Pope makes quite clear in this document about examining the vision of the human person that we have when we're building these technologies. And so from the Pope's perspective, the vision of the human person that we need to have is one that is grounded in dignity. And he makes some comparisons about how that is being lost in some of the ways that we currently think about the vision of the human in relation to these AI technologies. And I think that's really interesting and taking the conversation to a different level to where we usually have the conversation.
So I think it's really important to acknowledge here that the encyclical is grounded in Catholic theology.
Yes.
So I'm curious to understand how Catholicism or religion more broadly is shaping the understanding of dignity, and whether or not there are different understandings of dignity outside of not just Catholicism, but other religions as well. So a religion agnostic understanding of dignity.
Yes. So certainly, and I'm by no means like an expert on the Catholic faith, all the other religions, but I have looked into the views of how people think about and talk about dignity as part of my work, because the framework that I've been developing does take on a pluralistic stance towards what dignity is and means. And so as part of that, I have looked across different faith traditions to see, what do other people say about this? And there are some similarities, perhaps not using the word dignity, but certainly similar ideas across different faith traditions. And certainly there is an agnostic or secularized view of what dignity is. And we see that in a few different places. We see that in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, for example, which is, religion agnostic. And sort of the bedrock of that Declaration of Human Rights is dignity. That is in the preamble of that document. And that's when we have human rights-based conversations, we generally end up in a conversation starting with or involving dignity in some form. And that dignity is very connected to, what the Pope is talking about, this inviolable state that as humans we have a dignity that cannot be taken away, cannot be given. It just is. And I suppose in the Catholic tradition, the reason why that it just is because we're made in the image and likeness of God. So that part is not, present in the human rights documentation, but it's certainly this idea that it's an essence that we have is. And the other place that we do see it is often in constitutions. So several countries, whether they're not religious states by nature, they're, the national constitution, they will talk about dignity in the preamble of their constitution. Not Australia, but other jurisdictions do. And certainly in the context of AI ethics. And, one of the initial reviews of AI ethics guidelines back in 2019, they reviewed over 100 global guidelines, and they distilled, so this is a Jobin and Al paper from 2019, they distilled it, I think, to 11 or 12 core principles that existed across all of those guidelines, and dignity was one of those few, one of those that were mentioned in multiple different ways. So it's certainly in the general vernacular. What it really means, though, is, it's sort of a felt sense in many cases, or in some cases, it is just sort of used interchangeably with human rights, for example, which is not necessarily how the Catholic Church is viewing it. Like, they have a very specific view about what it is and why it is that we have it. But I think that it is certainly something that permeates more than just the Catholic community. And we can see it in these different documents and even in AI ethics literature, although there is an ongoing debate about its usefulness. It's also been present in a lot of other ethical debates, even like in bioethics, for example, as well. Dignity sort of was a really common theme that came up. So it has a long history in thinking about the ethics of technologies beyond just the Catholic Church, I would say.
What's interesting to me is the idea of the Catholic Church having an opinion on AI, right? And the way that it's framed around human dignity makes me think that at least the perceived stakes of AI seem to be quite high, right? If we've got the Pope releasing an encyclical that has a very strong focus on AI and emerging technologies and the impact to human dignity, it
Yes.
does make you seem that there's kind of this very high perceived impact or perceived stakes around the impacts of AI. So from that perspective, is there any other comparable thing, be it technology or not, that has a similar impact on human dignity? What is another thing that we can point to that
Yes.
impacts human dignity or has the potential to impact human dignity in the same way that we're talking about AI? Because I think it's important to understand, why is there this connection between AI and emerging technology and human dignity? And if we had maybe a point of comparison, it might be a bit
Mhm.
easier to understand that.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, I think in more recent times, conversations around bioethics, for example, has certainly involved conversations around dignity. But in the encyclical itself, it does talk about this sort of historical lineage of, why the Catholic Church weighs in on these, matters of grave interest to the future of how we see ourselves. And the lineage that it talks to is the last industrial revolution and Pope Leo the 13th. So the one we have now is Pope Leo the 14th, but Pope Leo the 13th was at the forefront of creating an encyclical at the time, talking about that technological transition, which was around, industrialization. And at that point, that was when terminology such as the dignity of work came into the fore. That was sort of through that encyclical, the conversation began around, well, what dignity is associated with working, and having work. So some of that's about workers' rights, but some of that is also about how we as humans, it's like a condition of our state as humans that we find value and meaning in work. And so in the encyclical, it does sort of trace this lineage of, there was an important opinion then. There's been important opinions around other introduction of other technologies, reproductive technologies, for example, bioethics. These things are not so specified in the document, but you can see that there are lots of instances where technological change is shaping how we see ourselves as humans, as much as we're shaping it. And so the Catholic Church sees that they have a role as a global institution, as well as, having a spiritual dimension to actually weigh in on, from a theological perspective, what it is that we are as humans, and how these technologies may shift that, in good and bad ways. And the document does talk about how technology itself isn't bad. So there's not like an anti-technology sentiment, but there is a clear argument that there's lots of different ways in which these technologies can be used, and that we need to be very discerning, and exercise ethical judgment in that conversation. And this encyclical really, yeah, forces us to have some of these conversations. And not only does it look backwards, but it also looks forwards to post-human and transhuman conversations that are already emerging. And it has some very clear views on how the image of the human that is underlying that agenda is antithetical to a dignity depiction, like to having dignity. So this idea that post or transhumanists agenda is based on trying to eliminate limitation, or create some sort of perfected human, is actually degrading to human dignity, and that there's actual value in limitation, and there's value in suffering, there's value in hope and in disappointment, and that these things, love and suffering, coexist, for example, is something that is written about in this document. And these things are all uniquely human. So I think that, it is a long lineage of the Catholic Church having an opinion about matters about how humans are, and, behave, and what we want to be as a humanity, and what our humanness means. So it makes sense that, that given this is the next industrial revolution, that there's an opinion here as well. What that means in practice, I think, is another question. And I think it is interesting that the, co-founder of Anthropic was there for the launch of this document, as well as representatives of the Global South, as well as representatives like women theologians. So, there is an active effort to try and expand the relevance of what this encyclical does and means. But let's see what the infiltration looks like and how people take it up from here.
I think it's important to remember that while the Catholic Church has a lot of symbolic weight, they don't really have any authoritative weight, right? Like they don't carry any kind of authoritative power. And so for me, I'm curious to see how much of that symbolic weight is going to actually influence or shape what we see come out or emerge from the AI space. But on your point around, you know, there's dignity kind of in suffering and in hope and in disappointment. And I guess it's about both sides of the coin, right? Life can't be all good and shouldn't be all bad. And so it's about both sides of that coin. And I do recall seeing in the encyclical that there was reference to this idea of AI promoting humans being ever more efficient and, you know, working more and making less mistakes and being the most efficient versions of ourselves. And I found that really interesting and fascinating to me, the connection between that and dignity and this idea that, you know, you don't have to be the most 100% efficient version of yourself. And I don't know about you, but for myself, you know, I set myself a to-do list every day, and this is going to say so much about me, but I love to check off an item on a to-do list once it's done. It brings me a lot of gratification.
Yeah, I'm sure you're not
the only one. And at the end of the day, it says a lot about me as a person. But at the end of the day, if I have not checked off all of the items that I set myself for that list, I do feel very disappointed in myself. And I feel like I wasn't efficient and I feel like I didn't get enough done. So I think that was something that really clicked for me, was this idea of efficiency. And while there is dignity in work and we do find value in work, there needs to be that balance. And with a lot of the narratives around AI, we do see that narrative of like, way more efficient and, you know, you'll get way more done and blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
And so I guess that was just something that stuck with me.
Yeah, and I think that efficiency narrative, I mean, and there's obviously some good to come from efficiency, but I think that what this sort of points to is what makes us human is not how efficient we are. You know, we could be incredibly inefficient and still be very, very human. So sort of optimizing for efficiency can come at the expense. It can come with a dehumanizing impact that, you know, I am just a cog in the wheel. What I'm doing doesn't matter to, you know, to myself or to anyone else. And that can be a real problem for, you know, where we're seeing automation going in the future as well. So I think that at the root of it all, I mean, it is a bit comforting, you know, in a way that you have innate dignity. Doesn't matter what you do, really. I mean, obviously there are some things which can degrade and violate other people's dignity, but you have an innate dignity just for being human. It's not something that is earned. I think a lot of times, and Professor Donna Hicks talks about this a lot in her book, where she talks about 10 essential elements of dignity, that often people, you know, mix up dignity and respect. And her way of thinking about it, which is really interesting to me, is that like respect is something that's earned. So you have to do something in order to earn respect, whereas dignity is not that. So there's nothing to be done. There's no efficiency to be gained. It's an innate quality of being human. And she makes a really clear distinction of that in her work, which is not grounded in Catholic teaching. It's more focused on, you know, how to resolve international conflicts between parties at the negotiating table, and how recognition of dignity is really important. And ideally a repair of any dignity violation is really important before you can even do the negotiation, even if there is a tactical or operational solution that both parties are theoretically okay with. Her research shows that you can't get to that level of negotiation until there's an underlying respect for dignity.
On the point of kind of words that get conflated with dignity, or the words that get associated with dignity, you know, as you spoke about respect there, there's one line in the encyclical that stuck out to me, and it is, for AI to respect human dignity and truly serve the common good, responsibility must be clearly defined at every stage. So can you explain to me a little bit this connection between responsibility and human dignity and how that's come into play?
Yes. I'm actually really interested in this connection as well, because a lot of my work is on responsible AI, and that one sort of enactment of responsibility is centering dignity. So it's interesting to try and untangle this connection, because they are often talked about in connection with each other in this encyclical. So having a responsibility to dignity, or dignity being about exercising responsibility. So one way that I've been thinking about this, and I think is reflected somewhat in this encyclical, is that if we are recognizing human dignity, then we are also recognizing that we are part of like a human family, like a human global family, because this is something that we all have in common. And this is where in the encyclical, it does often talk about dignity and common good together. So there's a recognition that dignity is important and a goal that we are working towards a common good. And I think that this is where responsibility comes in, is sort of our commitment to this. If we believe that we all have this dignity, if we believe that everyone has it and we're part of a human family, then flowing from that is a responsibility to uphold that dignity in the things that we do. And this also, coming back to the previous comment around, different religious or cultural ways of thinking about dignity, this idea of like reciprocity or communal senses of dignity does come out, particularly in non-Western views about dignity, that, I am because you are, this sort of like Ubuntu sort of perspectives on who we are as humans is inextricably linked with being in a communal sense, like that we need to be in community as much as we need to be an individual. And I think that this is where the responsibility part comes in, because if you accept that you are both an individual and part of a community, then you have a responsibility to self and to others. And this is, it's sort of part and parcel of being, of accepting that dignity is a thing. Then you are then part of this, broader community, and there's responsibilities that come with that.
I do remember that this was the interpretation of dignity that resonated the most with me when we spoke about this
Last
in
time.
the
Yeah.
first time that you were on the podcast.
Yeah,
It was this
okay.
idea of a communal dignity that really resonated with me.
Yes, that, you can really be your dignified self in relation, because you are in relation to others. And I think that that's where responsibility
Yeah.
comes in. And I think the other part of this, and this is where it's quite interesting, because in the same way that there's lots of ways of thinking about dignity, there's also lots of ways of thinking about responsibility. And I've noticed, and I probably will look at this in more depth in this document, around the different ways that responsibility is talked about in this document. So in some cases, responsibility is talked of here as essentially an accountability mechanism. So we need to be able to have people who can take account at different stages of the process, is one sort of form of responsibility that's talked about. But there's also these sort of responsibilities like more as a virtue, like we have a responsibility because we are human to one another and to ourselves. That's not taking account for a decision. That's more you're acting in a wider frame of, what you feel like is a virtue or a competency that you want to exercise. In the same way that there's multiple ways of thinking about dignity, there's multiple ways of thinking about responsibility. And you can see some of those ways coming out here. I think the other part of this is not just a responsibility to protect from bad things happening, but also a responsibility to make the most of what can be good in the age of AI as well. And that sort of hope and love, and it being a construction site, that imagery that we're part of a construction site does evoke a sense of, we can choose how we're going to build lives with AI in them. And this is sort of what the document is really asking us to make a conscious, discerning choice about the construction site that we want to be a part of.
One of the other concepts that was connected to human dignity in the encyclical on multiple occasions was ethics. So we had responsibility, and then the other one was ethics. And you've mentioned ethics a few times as well. And there was a very specific focus on ethics in the context of AI weapon systems. So when AI is used in military context.
Yes.
And there was a specific line from the encyclical I want to read out, which is where there was an advocacy for rigorous ethical constraints to guarantee respect for human dignity. And basically what they were kind of explaining in that was this idea of the decisions on life and death, right? And the decisions on life and death not being obfuscated to a machine and remaining with the person. But I found the idea that it was an ethical constraint a little bit difficult to grapple with. So can you kind of connect for me ethics and human dignity And can we also maybe touch a little bit on this idea of human dignity in the context of warfare, which I know is a
Mm.
hugely contentious topic as well?
Wow, they're big topics. I think
They are. I'm sorry.
well, I'll do my
It's like
best.
10
I mean,
questions in one, basically. I was
yeah,
like,
it's a
can you
lot of questions, but what I found with that part of the encyclical where it's talking about war is that there was a level of specificity about what the ethical constraints could look like to assist with,
That's true.
respecting dignity. So, and I found that these were quite interesting, the three that were discussed. So the first one around taking personal responsibility so that you can sort of trace it back to a human. And I think that this is, it's interesting. I think at the root of a lot of these things is we need humans to be humans in the process for it to be mutually dignifying, to respect dignity of the person involved in the decision making and also the person impacted. So this idea of chain of responsibility is kind of point to your point about you can't automate all decisions about life and death. Also, the idea around a moral time frame, so not condoning this very quick decision making time frame where we can't actually use our full faculties. And I imagine as a constraint that's quite a difficult one in warfare where decisions do generally need to be made with in the moment in some cases. So this sense of slowing down
Well, there's
is
contention around
challenged.
that, really true. There's kind of this argument between a perceived military necessity and then the time that is actually
Yes,
required for some of those decisions. So it's contested.
it's contested. So bringing that back into the forefront of, well, okay, let's consider what a moral time frame looks like as part of this ethical container or ethical constraint. And then the third one that's discussed is seeing the faces, I suppose, was a part of the language that was used. So the identification and protection of civilians. And this idea of proximity, I suppose, to the impacts that you're having. And I feel like that this is the case obviously in war where the impacts are so profound on human faces. And we also see this more generally when we talk about AI that, we've got such a supply chain associated with building these products that decisions get stacked one on top of the other without a firm understanding of the faces of the people that are being impacted by those products. So it's sort of like this is at an extreme, context of not seeing the faces. So proximity to others is really an important ethical constraint. So how you build that into um, how war is done uh, has a lot of complexity to it because it's obviously not just about an individual nation state or particular army or navy or whatever, but also like the global sentiment. And so the international angle to and the international framework of how these things exist or coexist together then becomes a very important part of the conversation. And in another way, like an ethical constraint is having international rules about how warfare is done. So I think that at the root of all of that, the connection then to dignity is, the dignity of the individuals that are being impacted, as well as the dignity of those making the decisions, and anyone else that's involved. Obviously, it's a big system. So, what we seem to be having conversations about is like automating decision making, which takes out the human from both the decision making part and also from seeing the impacts of what happens. And this is where we get, this sort of rupture between the actions that are being taken and the implications. And that is a dignity violating activity that we're engaging with by setting up warfare in that way would be one way in to think about it.
Do you feel, and this is another big question, I apologize, but do you feel like the conversations around human dignity and warfare are in a lot of senses technology agnostic, particularly on that last point on protection of civilians and the impact of civilians? One of the things I talk about a lot in my research, is it an AI problem or is it just a problem? And I guess that's what
Yes.
I'm trying to get at with this question. When we're talking about human dignity in the context of warfare, is it a broader human dignity problem because of the structure and the nature of warfare, or has AI introduced new kind of impacts or implications on human dignity? You know, the
I think
chicken and
that,
the egg, I guess.
yeah, I think the automation part does amplify the dignity impacts because there's distance, increased distance and scale created by inserting automated technologies that you might not see in, warfare from 100 years ago. I think that the other part that's really discussed in relation to that is that, there are other tools available around negotiation, like the art of negotiation, of dialogue, and these things as being alternatives that need to be seriously considered, not in some utopian sense, but in, a very practical way. And I suppose that's where we get other, if we think about, that being a form of addressing warfare, then it's quite a different context where, it is human to human interaction, to negotiate, to dialogue, to be in interaction with each other. So I think that there's something about the way in which AI and automation puts us, in more silos, increases the distance between decision and action, that is an amplification because of the technology. And that lack of connectivity, because, we are ultimately relational beings. A lot of the root of the dignity conversation is the relational nature of us as humans. And if we're engaging in warfare in a very non-relational way in many ways, then that is a threat to dignity on all sides, both perpetrators and victims.
So I guess it's interesting as well what you mentioned earlier about the CEO of Anthropic being there, and he also gave a speech, and I'll put in the description for our listeners a link to that speech because they uploaded it on the Anthropic blog.
Mm-hmm.
But to me, it was fascinating because I was like, you guys are still in the midst of a lawsuit with the US Department of Defense because you sold them some of your products. And when they came forward with these 2 red lines that they wanted, which, just to remind everyone, the first one was no mass domestic surveillance, did not say anything about surveillance in other countries, but it was no mass domestic surveillance, and no fully autonomous weapon systems. They came in with those 2 red lines, but outside of those 2 red lines, there was still a huge amount of possible applications of their technologies in a military context. And, they've got this very public dispute. They're in the midst of this lawsuit, and I've seen them rebrand themselves as this AI safety company. And now we're seeing them give a speech at the Vatican alongside the Pope in support of this encyclical, which talks about all these ethical guidelines, particularly on the use of AI in warfare and things like that. And so from my perspective as well, I guess this is why I'm struggling to grapple with the kind of the links between ethics and the technology, particularly in this context, because I'm like, if we're going to talk about ethical guidelines in a theological text, but we're going to do it with the support of a kind of shady gray area company that's in the midst of this lawsuit and is trying to basically rebrand. I guess those are the things that I really struggle to grapple with. So on the
Yes.
point of human dignity, I want to
Yes.
understand from you, how can we take the notions of human dignity seriously when it is presented to us in this broader context that really doesn't uphold the things that we're talking about when we talk about human dignity?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think that it is very interesting, like the collection of people that were, at that launch and talked about different parts of
Right.
the
If I was
encyclical.
asked to write up the list of potential guests for this kind of thing, I don't think the
Well, it's
co-founder of
it's
Anthropic would have
really
been on my
interesting. And
list.
also the thing about what he said, what the co-CEO of Anthropic said, um, was very much, a discussion about like the incentive structures being a hindrance to Anthropic, taking responsibility, and therefore the need for organizations or institutions and voices like the Catholic Church to continue to push them from the outside of these systems, which is a bit at odds with what's actually being said in the encyclical about the role of everyone in doing this work.
Right.
And so it is interesting, like
This is just like a tad of a contradiction.
So it is interesting the choices to A, have Anthropic there, and B, for what Christopher said and its connection to the text. there being some, it does talk also in Encyclical about perverse incentives, but it doesn't excuse that as a reason for non-action, right? It just talks about that as the context within which we need to work. So I feel as though the actions that can be taken when it comes to dignity, obviously, yes, there are really perverse incentives against taking dignity affirming actions in companies. However, there are lots of examples, like this is not a new problem, like in the sense of we need to value humans because we care about humans is, like it feels silly to say that, but that's kind of what we're saying, right? Is that how do we value humans in the creation of technologies? And that's not unique to AI. That's also been the conversation of corporate social responsibility, for example, like how do we value humans in sustainability conversations? Like there's obviously lots of things that have happened within the corporate sphere to talk about and address some of these challenges. The thing that they talk about in the encyclical around the role of power in this conversation is also really important, that there's a concentration of power, there's, and marginalization happens as a result of that. There's clear dignity implications of having a concentration of power in private companies that is talked about in the encyclical, whereas, in the past big technological changes, the state has been much more involved than what we're seeing in the current situation, which is, very privately engaged. So there's a part of me that really feels, this responsibility conversation is also, you have a platform to undertake your responsibility within. And obviously that looks different for everyone, but large tech companies also have that platform and that responsibility and that need to make commitments and actions towards dignity. On a super practical level, I mean, the organizations that I've been working with who care about dignity, they have dignity related commitments in, say, their manifestos or other values based documents. But then they also back that up with how they actually do technology development in the everyday. So, for example, one example of a company that I've been working with, they have implemented the dignity lens that I've been working on with them is now part of how they do software development. So, in the same way that they would have like Jira tickets, like these sort of ways in which they chop up what they're doing to build a product, they have tickets in their system or, reminders, processes that force them to stop and reflect and think about the dignity implications of what they're doing. So it's embedded in an existing system that they're using to really have these conversations as they go, not just at the end, not just in review, and organizationally create context for reflection, having hard conversations together, and taking action in accordance with the values. So there are examples of this happening. It's not beyond the realm, but obviously there probably will be some loss from a financial perspective of moving really, really, really fast in the short term, because it does take a bit longer to have this conversation as you go. I mean, but what it doesn't really equate for is, how you bring humans along the journey with you, your value of humans as users and customers as a result of doing this, the decreased risk of ethics washing or other sorts of catastrophes later. So I think the time frame within which we're thinking about this is really important, and framing the whole AI conversation as a race is really counterproductive to this style of discernment and ethical consideration, which is also talked about in the encyclical as being problematic. Like the language that we use is problematic. And I would say that that's also the case in the organizations I've seen. They take much longer term views about what they're actually trying to do. They're not trying to win a race. They're trying to build great products that take their customers and clients on a journey, and they value them as humans for the long term. So it does matter a lot what your value system is. Obviously, it's influenced by your incentive structure and all those things that was talked about by Christopher, but there are also other ways and other influences that could be used with the platforms that they have, is my opinion on that.
And on the point of time, that was specifically called out in the encyclical. There was a specific call out on the need for slowing down. But what was interesting is it was caveated with slowing down will not impede innovation. So the fact that that caveat even had to be put there, we need to slow down and take our time, but don't worry, it's not going to impact innovation. We'll still be fine. It was interesting for me to see that, right? Because we always see these kinds of arguments of regulation will slow down innovation, taking your time will slow down innovation. And so for me, having that very kind of pointed line in there that said, we need to slow down and it will not impact innovation. I mean, it brought a smile to my face to see it, but the fact that even something like that had to be caveated, and it did because of what you were saying, right? Like we framed AI as this race, and in order to counter that very dominant argument that we're currently seeing, you have to include all of these caveats for saying something that is so entirely reasonable and makes
Yes.
complete common sense. And I think
Yes.
that's a bit that I'm struggling with, right? On balance, I felt the encyclical was pretty good. They made pretty pragmatic recommendations and statements. So on balance, I didn't really have major concerns with the encyclical. It was the heavy caveating that I found the most fascinating when reading, because I'm like, oh, you're really trying to get ahead of this very, very dominant narrative. And in order to do that, you have to have
Yes.
all of these heavy caveats
Yeah.
against the most basic common sense stuff.
It's interesting, and I do wonder, yeah, I wonder the strategic, rationale behind that for reaching an as wide a group as possible and feeling so people feeling like they are within the audience of who they're talking with, which I also think is, potentially why, the group of people that were part of that invitation for launching, was a spread. Um, so it is interesting, the dissemination politics of of how this gets received and the language used is very interesting, and I'll be interested to see who takes it on as something that they care about and who just thinks it's a peripheral kind of conversation.
Yeah, and I mean, look, the religious context is something that does have to be taken into consideration, right? We spoke about this a bit earlier, but the encyclical is grounded in Catholic theology, and that's not something that everybody follows, or it's not everybody's compass. And so that also needs to be taken into consideration as well. As much as we can sit here and say that on balance it was quite pragmatic and reasonable, if it's not the direction or the compass that a lot of people want to follow, it's not really going to make an impact. And I think this is kind of what I was saying earlier when I said that the Vatican carries symbolic weight, sure, but they don't really have any authoritative power. And that's the
Mm.
important part to remember.
Yeah, it will be interesting to see, yeah, what the ripple effects are, and the sort of legitimizing environment that the Vatican has been able to create by having this document. That it is, in the vernacular in a different way now. There is language around things that people can kind of hang on to. There are, lots of business leaders who, are connected in some way to the Vatican. I mean, it's not the first time that they've been engaged in these conversations. The Rome call to action on AI ethics, I think it's called, was, from several years ago now, where big tech companies did sign on to that,
Yeah.
was run through the Vatican. So, there is influence. It's sideways influence, but yes, it's certainly not authoritarian, or an authority in that sense. But I think that there is some ripple effects that could come from this. And personally, the centering of dignity in this conversation, I think is really appealing to a wide audience, even though, even though you might not subscribe to the whole breadth of the Catholic Church teachings. But this sense of a humanness, and rallying against dehumanization, I think has wide appeal.
I agree. And I think this is probably a great segue into our last question to wrap up what has been an incredibly fascinating episode. So, Lorenn, what is one piece of advice that you would give for people for engaging with technology safely and responsibly? So, what is your one responsible bite?
My one responsible bite, I think, is very similar to the last responsible bite, but I didn't double check this, which is really engaging in what the encyclical talks about as discernment, but what we might talk about in more common terms as reflective practice. So engaging with being a human while interacting, or if you build, design, deploy these products, that there's something in discernment, reflective practice, in the being human while you're doing that needs to be conscious and front of mind. So discernment, reflective practice, really important as we engage and build these products.
That's great advice, even if you have given it twice. And to be honest, I can't remember what the advice was last time either. So we're just going to move forward on the basis that this is new advice. All right, Lorenn, thank you so much for being on the podcast again. For all of our listeners, I will leave links to where you can find Lorenn and where you can read more about her work. I will also leave a link to the original episode where Lorenn first joined us on the podcast in the description below. But thank you again, Lorenn.
Thank you so much, Zena.